So welcome everybody. Thank you for still being here at lunchtime. I know everybody's probably ready to take a little break, but I am going to talk through universal design for learning and library instruction in particular. I'm the coordinator of reference and instruction at SUNY Cobleskill, and I am basing what I know about UDL on a training I did last semester with the SUNY Center for Professional Development. So not an expert, but I'm really going to be focusing on just some ways to apply this framework to what you do in the library classroom. So, oops, let me go back. I wanted to start with a little brainstorming activity in Padlets, and I will drop that Padlet link in the chat. And what I'm going to ask you all to do is to think about a recent library instructional session that you taught, maybe your goals for that session, and then a barrier to learning as a way to sort of kick off our UDL thinking on information literacy instruction. And I'm going to see if I still have that tab up. So yeah, I went ahead and seeded a couple of library instructional barriers that I have seen, such as students not having a recollection of how to return to library guides after a library session, or one that is like a techie problem is like the track pads on our library computers moving really quickly and students not really being able to just navigate some of the resources that I'm asking them to look at. So if you haven't used Padlets before, I know you have since they've been in some other sessions this morning, there's a little blue plus sign at the bottom of the page. Just drop your ideas in there. I'm going to let that run in the background as I talk through some of the other elements of my presentation. And then as we come to the end, we'll come back to this Padlet. And I see some other people's ideas are already popping up in there. Differences between mobile and desktop navigation, students not having familiarity with just the idea of keywords. That's one that I see a lot. Login pages, excellent. So let me go back and present this again. So that is in the chat if you missed it. And the outline of this presentation, I'm just going to talk a little bit about UDL, core principles of UDL. I'm sort of assuming most of you all probably have some familiarity already with these concepts, and the focus is really going to be looking at library instruction. So I'm taking this definition from the University of Illinois, Chicago. There's lots of definitions out there on the web. This is one that I liked. UDL is an educational framework for creating learning environments that address the diverse needs of learners. At its core, UDL provides students flexibility in ways they access and engage with course materials. And I really, as you can see, I highlighted the idea of flexibility. As I'm sort of parsing how UDL is useful in library instruction, it is the idea of that sort of flexibility, that putting like different options for how students engage with the course and engage with what you're teaching, that sort of like opens what you're trying to teach to more different types of learners and different students. The idea is that you're focusing on making an accessible curriculum rather than putting the onus on students to request any kind of accommodation for accessibility, because there's just a wide variety in how people learn and remember information, et cetera. So that's sort of the core of what UDL is talking about. It comes from the concept of universal design in architecture. So as you can see, this is a picture of a wheelchair stopped at a curb without a curb cut. And obviously that's an accessibility issue for that person who's using a wheelchair. And in universal design in architecture, the idea is that design changes that make the physical environment, for example, more accessible for people who use wheelchairs will also make the physical environment more accessible for lots of other people who are using strollers, who might be pushing a cart, people with other mobility issues that aren't to the level of using a wheelchair would still benefit from those changes, so that there's a wide variety of people who might benefit from small changes in the built environment. The same is true in the educational environment if you're making a lesson that's accessible to the widest variety of learners. Universal design is based around these three principles of engagement, representation, and action and expression. And then it can be sort of further broken down into a lot of granular detail. The core principles of providing different modes for students to engage with course content, or different types of representing the material of the course in different ways. Each of those are sort of broken down into different guidelines and checkpoints within this universal design framework. So the CAS UDL guidelines is where all of that information lives. If you're interested in learning more about the nitty-gritty details of universal design for learning as a framework, I encourage you to go to this site, and I have this linked at the end of the presentation as well, and maybe I'm going to just drop it in the chat for you here so that you can access it if you would like while I'm talking through the rest of the slides. But one of the things that is nice about CAST and the way that they're presenting information about sort of what UDL is and suggestions for how to use the framework in instruction is that they do have this as sort of a visual layout, recruiting interest, as you sort of see these main principles that they have, their guidelines, and then these granular detail of their checkpoints. When I was originally conceiving of this presentation, I sort of was going deep down into all the different levels of what UDL is, and I realized that that very quickly becomes overwhelming. So I am going to, as I said, instead of focusing a lot on what exactly UDL is, I'm going to talk about how I can use those core principles in library instruction. And first, just as I had you all do, I think it is most effective when you're trying to adapt a lesson, thinking about UDL and thinking about the UDL framework. It's useful to start with barriers that you're observing. So when you're doing a regular database lesson, what is it that might be keeping different students in your classes from learning? And then you just address those barriers. You don't necessarily have to redesign every lesson that you teach. And actually, I suggest that you don't, but that you sort of like use the framework as a philosophy or as a guiding principle in order to focus in on one or two guidelines. Thomas Tobin is an educational theorist in this field, calls it the +1 principle, where you just target that one area and then try to offer an alternative way of thinking or an alternative way of doing or engaging with your lesson. And then obviously, or always, there's the assessment component. And sort of over time, you can sort of build in these instructional design modes for your classes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through a couple of examples for how I have used this framework to sort of think through redesigning some of these lessons that I have been teaching, or some of the problems that I've been having in instruction, in library instruction. So problem number one that I'm going to use a UDL principle to solve is I'm observing that students are often disengaged from database lessons. If I'm teaching just a standard lesson, I've been asked to come into the classroom, they need to know how to use our discovery service so that they can access peer-reviewed articles, like the very sort of bread and butter of library teaching. And I'm activating that first UDL principle, the multiple means of engagement. So if they're disengaged, what I want is to offer different ways to engage students in my class instead of just listening to me speak through and demo the databases. What are some other ways that I can engage students? And going back to the CAST, that whole sort of structure that they have, I sort of dug in from my UDL principal. I looked at some of their guidelines. So one of the guidelines is, how do you recruit student interest? Like, what do you do to actually recruit student interest and engage that part of their mental processes? And within that, there's suggestions for like social learning and active engagement. And as I said earlier, UDL isn't necessarily just choosing one thing, like, oh, we're going to all be doing social learning now for the entire class, but just offering some of those options to engage some of the students who might be motivated by those factors, by getting up out of their seats, etc. So this is a redesigned lesson. You can see I started with just, when I started 2 years ago here with basic database lessons, and in the example that I have something called Team Search, and this is actually adapted from something I got out of the library instruction cookbook, which I really just liked a lot of those different options that people offered. And what I had students doing, this was a follow-up, this was sort of a second level class, and it was early on in their research journey before they had really had topics or anything like that. They just had, I needed them to explore some of this stuff in the discovery service so that we could then talk about it. And I had them in groups, like, do a challenge, go post your sticky note on the board once you figure out how to use the star in your search. And then we could talk about it, because I could say, oh, pink group, what did you guys find? I see some questions in the chat. Was the UDL training? Oh, the UDL training, I'm sorry, I skipped right over that. It was taught by, yes, Christopher Hromalik from Onondaga Community College. So shout out to him, as I said at the beginning. So thank you so much for asking that, Jocelyn. And then, as I said, part of what you're always doing as an instructor is assessing how things go. So this was a I had 3 sections of the same class, and these are labs that I have with the Fisheries and Wildlife program, one fish and wildlife class. And what I did after that session was debrief with the faculty member. We sort of talked about how it went, sort of what we were observing from the students, and ultimately we revised the initial activity to narrow it down and sort of focus it for students, so that then those conversations could be a little bit more targeted around what he wanted them to get out of it and what I was hoping for them to get out of it. And so then we could, have more time for other things in the class session. So that was a successful collaboration. I'm going to be teaching those again in just a couple weeks for this next time around. And I think there still might be some tweaks, but anyway. So same problem. Students are still disengaged from database lessons. And here I'm thinking through the same principle of engagement, principle of that there should be multiple means of engagement or multiple ways for students to engage with the content. And in this case, the sort of UDL framework checkpoints that I sort of used to help me sort of think through ways I could reframe this lesson were having that authentic learning experience that can help motivate students if it is connected to their goals. And so some students are going to be motivated by they need to figure out how to do this assignment, and that's what it is. So even if it's not social learning, then it's going to be those educational goals that they have. And in this case, students were working again in pairs, but it was like a kickoff activity. And then they were using the resources that they found to answer specific questions that were then, that they could then use in their actual projects. When I'm doing some sort of challenge or some sort of activity with students, I often will frame the pedagogical reason for why I'm asking students to do it. And I think that can help to make the connection for them to that authentic learning experience, rather than just, oh, we're doing this in class today to use up time or whatever it may be, so that they are reminded of the reasons that they should pay attention and try to remember what happened during the class. So here's a new problem, that students are not really retaining information that happens in library lessons. And the UDL principle of multiple means of representation, basically that principle states that because learners differ in ways that they perceive information and comprehend information, you should try to offer maybe one more modality for information comprehension. So if you are usually just talking over a slideshow, another modality for them to perceive that information is a guided notes page, potentially just like something that they can hold in their hands and follow along. And if you're doing a guided notes page, for example, which is this example here, you can also share that with the faculty member, ask them to post it to their Moodle account to make it more accessible to students who might be using assistive technologies or a screen reader, or who might engage best with something that is digital. They might take their notes in that guided notes page. And then some students actually write stuff down. So this is from a business administration class. It's a really large class. And some students were able to hold on to this. So I saw some of them in the library later, and I could ask, oh, do you have your notes page? And then they would dig through their folder or whatever they keep, and they could pull out the page. And then we could sort of remember, okay, so we're starting with the occupational handbook in order to address this in your focus analysis paper. In this case, they were working on these 2 projects sort of over the course of the whole semester. They had different parts of this to do. So that was a way of ideally helping students to have a little more retention, or have something that they could go back to if they needed. And also, I think having it posted in their Moodle page or their learning management page is really key to using the framework that they're already familiar with, rather than like teaching them a whole new like pathway from the library site to get to their library guide or whatever it is. Some other suggestions within this multiple means of representation UDL principle is to activate that background knowledge that they have. And you might be using stories and storytelling. You might be using like metaphor is like a big one. And somebody suggested this at the SUNYLA conference this past spring, but one example of helping to activate that background knowledge if you're doing a database lesson is to think of subject headings as hashtags. So they know what hashtags are, and then you're trying to teach this new concept. So how do you make that connection back to something that they know? So think of your subject headings as your hashtags. I haven't actually done that yet, but it's because I don't end up talking about subject headings a ton, but that type of thing can help sort of create those kernels of memory as the idea from the UDL framework. I see I've got some things in the chat. It sounds like lots of people are concerned with that retention of information. So yeah, definitely. And, you know, I guess one thing with UDL is that no one way is going to solve it, but it's always just like, you know, you keep sort of chipping away and thinking about, is there one other way I could do this and see if it works a little better for people. And similarly, something I've started to do, so the same problem about retention in lessons is how do you sort of chunk content? One way that the UDL print guidelines and checkpoints suggest is to chunk content and then put practice in between. And helping with perception and helping create those frameworks for memory. So I've started to do a standard top 5 tips for successful search for intro-level lessons that I can then, if I need to, if I'm going back to a class or going to an upper level class, I can roll it out. It's the top 5 tips. We go through it pretty quickly. They're the basics of like, how do you get into the library site? How do you sort of navigate a little bit? And having it be the same each time, those top 5 tips can help to create that memory framework that hopefully will bring them a little more success, so that they're not just going onto Google and grabbing all the stuff they find on Google and turning that in or whatever. And this is the last example that I'm going to share, but that there should be meaningful assessment. How do you meaningfully assess a one-off lesson? And multiple means of action and expression, that UDL principle is sort of stating that learners differ in how they navigate the information environment and how they express what they know. And as I was going through it, most of the guidelines and checkpoints communicated by the CAST program are really focused on like designing assignments that allow students to have creativity or have choice. Because as library instructors, we don't design the assignments. We might work with faculty, we might suggest things, but ultimately they design the assignments. What I'm thinking as ways of addressing this question or this problem are thinking about different ways of soliciting feedback from students. And this is, so I started using Google Forms to just like in class. Somebody suggested this, and I'm sorry I didn't look back. So if you're here, thank you. But somebody suggested using Google Forms in the last instructional showcase to like check and see if they got a permalink or ask them their research topics. And so then you can have this anonymous conversation with students right in the front of the class. And you can say, whoever is researching, companion dog nutrition, your permalinks aren't working. And so then you know that even if you thought everybody understood what you meant when you said something about permalinking, you can like right away give them that feedback. But within this principle, you're allowing them to express themselves differently, you're allowing them to act and engage with the content differently. So the suggestion from the sort of UDL framework side of things is that you would give them like a little bit of choice in how they engage with the lesson. So if you're doing a brainstorming activity that you're then going to pull keywords and go into the databases, maybe they want to do it on paper, maybe they want to write with their hands, maybe they would prefer to do it on a platform like bubble.us, which is this other picture that you can see here. So having that flexibility, having those options and choice gives students different ways of expressing themselves, and it also gives you different ways of getting feedback from students. So I am almost out of time. I've been talking a lot actually. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do, your last part of your activity for brainstorming is to go back to that Padlet from the beginning of the class and comment in a suggestion to one of your other people's issues. See if you can think of a UDL based solution or a suggestion for how to solve one of those problems that they're having. And if you have questions for me, please drop them in the chat if you would. Oh, Danielle Apfelbaum from Farmingdale did the session on Google Forms from last year. So also thank you for the call out, Jocelyn, to Danielle. And absolutely, yes, you can get I'll share a copy maybe with Jocelyn of the slide deck. And as I said, there's a couple different resources here at the end for UDL CAST guidelines. Let me get out of this. And let me see if I still have my Padlet open here. Oh, lots here on the Padlet too, which is wonderful to see. And so here's one that I see that I think looks interesting. Many students have never checked out a book and don't know what a call number is. That is definitely something I have seen. And somebody else comments, maybe a funny video or a story about how to find books in the library. I have found that just sort of sending them out into the stacks, they're usually able to figure out how to use a call number too. Similar, somebody else comments in, I like to take a photo of a call number label on a book in our collection so that they know what it looks like. And then they'll know what they're looking for. So that helps to create that framework for students who may be intimidated by just sort of having to go out into the stacks. Somebody is saying lack of familiarity with brainstorming keywords. That was one I noticed at the beginning too. And then somebody comments back that it's an issue for sure. They've begun to ask students to work on a sentence on their research. Oops, and then I lost it. Where'd it go? And then select 2 or 3 words for them to search from, which is a nice suggestion. So providing those specific frameworks that can help students then. I think my time is up, and so it's 12:26 already. I'm going to stop sharing